Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm your host, and I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast is one of my favorite repeat guests. It's Neil Townsend, who is the chief market analyst with FarmLink Marketing Solutions and GrainFox. He and I have a great conversation about geopolitics and agriculture. Neil and I both write for the GrainFox platform, and if you want to see Neil and I in action, I should say, if you want to see me and Neil in action, I believe is the grammatically correct thing to say. We're speaking at a virtual event on October the 13th. We put a link to the event in the podcast description, so you can sign up for it if you want to. It'll be a fun event. It'll be me and Neil and a couple other folks who are giving some insights on geopolitics and agriculture and what to expect post-harvest of this year. So other than that, I hope you enjoy this long-ranging conversation. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast or about what we do at Cognitive Investments, you can always write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, cheers, and I will see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right. So, Neil, I can't remember the last time you were on the podcast, but it's really good to have you back.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's my opportunity to talk to you. Nonsense. I guess before we get to talking, we should say that the reason we're here, or one of the reasons we're here, is because we're both going to be speaking at a GrainFox event on October 13th at 10 a.m. I'll put that in the intro too. But if you guys want to sign up for that, check out GrainFox, and both Neil and I will be dropping our brilliance, or make of that what you will, on the audience. Neil, where should we start? Why don't we just start with kind of global food prices in general? So we're recording here on September 21st. It's a Wednesday. It's really hot in New Orleans today, by the way. I thought we were done with summer, but apparently we're not. But it's the same day that Biden came out at the UN General Assembly and said he's throwing $3 billion at food aid throughout the course of or he's throwing $3 billion of food aid out to the world because they're worried about food prices. The FAO Food Price Index is actually down again last month, and it's even starting to flirt with 2021 levels. But at the same time, when you look at the inflation print in the United States or the inflation print even in Canada, looks like energy prices are going down to me, but food prices are still going up. So how about just from the very top-down macro perspective, just food in general, what are you thinking right now in terms of where we're going to be for the rest of the year, and what should we be looking at to light our way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, inflation is something that sort of pains everybody, and it's in electoral politics or even in non-electoral politics, like the price of food is a sensitivity that, has been there since the dawn of group living, I guess. And, the latest prints that we saw in the United States and Canada, just as two examples for inflation, the last 2 months were, food inflation was kind of leading the way in terms of being one of the more expensive items. Now, of course, that's like grocery store food, which is, again, given the nature of the supply chain, it's probably lagging a little bit behind where the underlying commodity prices might be, because we have seen sort of, writ large sort of like wheat prices come off a little bit from their immediate post-war highs. And I think like what we're seeing there is that the cost of everything involved in producing food and shipping food and stocking it on a grocery shelf, I mean, all of those things are going into the higher price. Now, over time, I think, lower gasoline prices, lower wheat prices, lower corn prices, and I'm all talking relatively lower than where they were, when we were really amped up about the war, for example. They might have a payoff, and we might see the rate of that start to slow down. But we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. And you think about a grocery store, and you think about all the SKUs that are in a grocery store, like thousands upon thousands, and sort of like, a Whole Foods type place, or like a retail grocery store as opposed to like say a warehouse one, which tends to have less SKUs and just more of a certain things. But there's just so many manufacturers involved in that, all making independent decisions. All the trucks that have to transport that, any rail that's involved, ocean freight, wages, labor. There's a lot of things that go into food price, but definitely from a consumer side, I mean, nothing can make a person feel poorer than having to stretch their food budget, right? And what we do in, advanced societies typically was, we would choose between a variety of food choices and try to eat the same amount of calories. Whereas in the developing world, or say the less rich world, people would actually, and when food prices go up faster than wages, they may make a choice to kind of eat less calories, right? What we're hearing now, anecdotally, are people making the same decisions in places like, I've read articles about the UK, about Canada, about the US, about other parts of Europe where, people are, supposedly choosing to spend less money on groceries or buy less food and missing a meal, that kind of thing. And again, going back to the original answer to your question, and long-winded as it is, it's just that, it's such a conspicuous thing to have food affordability be a big issue with a majority of people. And one, sort of economic data point, again, anecdote, but factual, is, the Walmart, when they gave their last results out, said that, their biggest growth segment for their services or products is, families with an income over 100,000. And to me, drawing a line between those two dots are that, the family with the income over 100,000 is being pushed to, go to Walmart because, they're trying to save money on staples and groceries and stuff like that. So I find that very interesting. But I think that that's going to be a storyline throughout, the rest of this calendar year and well into the next calendar year.
Yeah, to your point, I was reading about Brazil this morning, and I know we want to talk about South America a bit, but which Brazil has elections coming up. They'll have the first round of their elections probably probably right around the time this podcast publishes. But there's been a lot of great top-down economic data out of Brazil this year so far. They've gotten inflation a little bit under control. You're starting to get growth and employment and things like that. But Bolsonaro's poll numbers aren't doing any better. And I read a really good analysis in a Brazilian paper today about how they said the reason for that is because food prices are going up for the poorest people. And all these handouts that they're doing doesn't mean anything because inflation was already rip-roaring for all this year. So they're actually not buying as much as they want. It's actually the rich or the higher income folks who are coming off the boil there. But so what does it mean for, you sort of mentioned inputs and producers and things like that. It sort of makes sense to me that wheat and corn and sunflower and some of these things have come off the boil from a cost perspective. But the one that I have trouble wrapping my brain around, maybe you can help me a little bit here, is fertilizer, because it seems like Russia and Belarus in particular still not dominate, but still play such a significant role in sort of the global market. And those supplies are still so low generally. And yet even I think fertilizer prices have come off the boil a little bit too. And I don't quite understand that, because for everything that's happened with the Russia-Ukraine war, it seems to me that there's the same dynamics in the fertilizer market. So am I missing something on fertilizer? Are you seeing that folks are using less fertilizer or shifting what crops they're planting as a result of fertilizer costs? How are you thinking about that input?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the complete answer except to say this, that I'd say there are some incongruities in the market. And one of them is probably like, you look at crude oil and underlying energy costs. I mean, they've gone way up, but I would also argue that crude oil seems, priced lower than maybe it should be. And with all the energy costs going up and fertilizer being produced, you would think, again, the cost has to be higher and people still need it. The only thing I can say is that I think, there's been various times where just the macroeconomic unease has been so great that we've seen brief capitulations on prices where, demand, maybe it's a negative inertia where demand is like, I'm not sure if I should buy any. I don't know what's going to happen. And, there's just enough of that to kind of drive the price down for a little bit. And, another factor as well in fertilizer, I think we have to consider this is that, one market that's really, is it the lead or the lag? I mean, I think it tends to be a lead in terms of economic activity, but we've seen ocean freight really come off. And so again, as a factor in the price, I mean, that does have a little bit of something to do with it. But generally speaking, like from a consumer or producer level, like a farmer producer, he's a consumer of fertilizers. We still get a tremendous amount of questions about fertilizer. It's top of their mind. And I don't think people are thinking of using less. And I'm talking about an American farmer, a Canadian farmer, even a Brazilian farmer. I think what they're thinking of mostly is like, what's the timing of buying it, right? And that is, again, like, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I just read today that Yara, one of the big producers, is going to, close a plant that they have in Belgium because, of natural gas prices. And, like if we see more of that sort of behavior, then we're probably going to see higher prices yet. And then I guess the other question, and you're probably better suited to answer this than I am, is just like, the war on the battlefield seems to be going quite poorly for Putin. Where he's had some success seems to be in driving the dynamics around, say, the Ukraine food corridor, and also using his leverage over, energy and other, key commodities over everybody else. And again, like, are they gonna continue to, allow access to fertilizer, or are they going to try to limit that as sort of a tactic to bring more, anger about the whole situation into Western countries and question, our support for Ukraine or something like that? Not that I'm saying that's going to have much impact overall, but maybe.
Well, I've been struggling with the Russia-Ukraine war because I feel like at every step along the way here, I've gotten Putin's mind wrong. And maybe that's good that I can't inhabit his brain. Maybe that says something good about my character, but it doesn't make me a particularly good analyst. But it seems to me that at every step of the way, he's doing things that geopolitically are against his interests. And the thing about things like when a country like Russia has that commodity leverage that you're talking about, ironically, that leverage is strongest when it's not being used, when you're threatening it. So another good example of this is when China and Japan had their spat over rare earth elements back in 2010, 2011. What was really powerful for China was the threat of blocking those exports to Japan. As soon as they actually moved to block the exports to Japan, all these Japanese companies said, "Oh, we can't trust China going forward. Oh, we're going to throw all of this capex at making sure that we can, de-risk our supply chains and find alternatives from the Chinese market, so that over the next couple of years they decrease their dependence on China, and then China didn't have the lever anymore." And I say that because maybe Putin thinks in his mind, yes, I can pull this lever when it comes to fertilizer or food or things like that. But I mean, you said it yourself. Is that actually diminishing European resolve or Canadian resolve or US resolve? It seems to me it's having the exact opposite effect. This week is the week that he's announcing partial mobilization and these referenda in these eastern regions, and maybe we're going to use nuclear weapons. All of that is floating out there in the Russian media, and it doesn't seem to me that that's going to make anybody in Berlin or Paris or Brussels say, yes, we should reach an accommodation with this guy. To me, it's going to mean the exact opposite, especially if you're going to punish some of these natural gas intensive European companies. So I don't know. I don't know what he's thinking, and I don't know what he thinks his end game is from here, because the more he pulls that chain on food prices and fertilizer and things like that, I think he actually just isolates himself in the grand scheme of things. And I don't know how that works for him.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an interesting predicament because, the Russians did pull off, an amazing crop. They grew around about 100 million tons of wheat, something that they haven't really, done, post-Soviet Union times. And normally that would mean 42, 44, 46, maybe even 48 million tons of exports. They've been performing relatively poorly unless, somehow the statistical agencies are missing it. I mean, they're on pace more for like a 32, 34. Yet it doesn't seem to be really a policy-driven reason for them to be behind. Maybe it has something to do with non-Russian owned ships having a little bit of a problem to go there. But that's one potential. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, maybe not like a life or death threat, but that is one threat to the market. Like if that performance does improve, if they start to put out more of that wheat, we could see a dip in the price. But again, I would say where Putin, in my opinion, has been successful in the execution of this war is where he's tried to get the most leverage over the West. And, I think he's done that with this export corridor. He's done that with some of the, inputs that they need. But, it's not quite hearts and minds. Like, I don't think people are really, the battlefield scenes are too graphic and too disturbing to really say, like, what, they're really pretty good guys, or Putin's a good guy because he's, helping us out with food or anything like that. I don't think anybody I've seen has reached that conclusion. And, it still has to unfold. Like in your opinion, we're having this talk here today, October 13th, the webinar that we're going to have. But if we look forward to the end of September, early fall next year, are we still going to be talking about this war? Is that war going to be ongoing? I mean, where do you see that happening, Jacob?
Yeah, well, I'll back into answering that question, which is that thing you said about the Russian wheat exporters is interesting, because another one of the things that I've been paying attention to is the Russian state is short on its government budget, and it's been slashing sort of government spending projections by 10% across the board. But one of the things that happened this week that sent the Russian stock market into a tizzy was that Putin was talking about applying some of these taxes that were just for Gazprom on producers of all export commodities. So for fertilizer, other natural gas exporters, oil exporters, and they're talking about taxes of around 30 to 50%, like export duties. I don't know what Russian storage looks like for farmers. I wouldn't imagine they have the most robust ability to store some of those things. But if I'm a Russian farmer and the Russian state is coming for 50% revenue off of what I'm exporting, I can imagine you might want to hold some of it. So maybe that I have no evidence for that, but there's an inference there. In terms of where we're going to be in a month, I'm gonna dance around your question, because if I had said where I thought we were going to be a month ago, I would have been completely wrong. I mean, the trajectory right now is that the Ukrainians are kicking their butts flat out. The Ukrainians are hitting them on two fronts. The Ukrainians have been able to rotate fresh forces on different fronts. We did a podcast with Simtak earlier this week, or I should say 2 weeks ago from when you guys are hearing this, about how the Russians are sort of screwed. So, and the other thing about Ukraine is that if you listen to what Zelensky is saying, and if you follow what they're doing, they're not talking about stopping once they hit Luhansk and Donetsk. They're also not thinking of stopping when they hit the 2020 invasion, or the February 2022 invasion borders. They're talking about, we want Crimea back too, and we want to take all of Donetsk and Luhansk too. And that's what we'll find out more about this, but Russia pushing these referenda this week in these areas that they've conquered, like the sort of unspoken thing in all of that as well. If they vote yes to become part of Russia, does Russia then consider them part of Russia? Does Russia treat attacks on those regions as an attack on the Russian Federation itself? Is that the excuse they need to use more weapons, or is that they're going to try to sell that to the population to justify calling up 300,000 Russian soldiers? All of that seems fairly untenable to me. I'm a little bit more worried about the future of Russia in all this, because I think Ukraine is going to keep pushing forward. There's no reason for the United States to stop arming the Ukrainians. And the Russians, if they keep on getting defeated and they keep on getting isolated from their energy export markets in Europe, I mean, how long does it take until the next Vladimir Putin comes and replaces Putin as he did to Yeltsin in the 1990s? Or in a worst case scenario, what happens when the people rise up and say, hey, Tsar Putin, like you're not much different than Nicholas II right now. Let's go full on Russian revolution and sort of overturn the system. So I hesitate to say that because it's pretty radical. But when I'm sitting here thinking the sort of unknown I'm thinking about is what happens to Russian wheat exports if the Kremlin falls, if Putin's no longer the leader, if they try to replace him, if the Russian people rise up. Like that's where my brain goes based on the variables that we're looking at today. So
yeah, and I think it's what we've seen with the Russian wheat industry, or called the grain industry, over the last 15 or 20 years, in the immediate aftermath of sort of the breakup of the Soviet Union, we did see, some Western companies come in there and start to build apparatus to move grain out once they realized that, there'd be more exports than imports needed, because prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, they were an importing country, solely because their food security plan was walking around in Russia. They had a massive quantity of animals at that time. Yeah. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union, they culled them all. But so, you had companies like Glencore and Cargill and others move in there. What we've seen over the last 10 years is some of those companies either reducing their footprint or moving out. And the companies that have replaced them are largely Russian-owned companies, many of them with, like tacit approval or even a direct link to sort of like Putin and his cronies. And so, yeah, like if Putin were to be on shaky ground or something like that, these companies, and they own the ships and the rail lines and the elevators and everything like that. I think the Russian farmer, I mean, they do farm on scale there. A lot of it comes from bigger production, and they have been facing a export tax. I think like it's amazing the universality of farmers around the world. Like, when they face adversity, be it, weather, be it, government. I mean, you think of the people in Argentina, the farmers there, and the governments they've had to put up with, and the attitudes there, be it government policy, be it weather, be it like, disease pressures, reluctant importers or something like that, trade wars, actual wars. I mean, farmers are a very resilient group. Like, what they love to do is they love to plant and they love to produce. And I mean, and that's part of the issue going forward, is that, when you have a sort of sustained period of high prices, a lot of people seem to take, where the prices are as sort of like, well, that's where the price should be, or it should be higher. And what happens is a reversion to mean, because, farmers all over the world, they get the same incentive, and that incentive is to grow. And their first approach when they see pressure on the price side, be it, a return on investment, so taking into account the inputs going up in cost and the outputs maybe not being at the price that they want, their first tactic is to yield their way to sustainability. So to try to increase yield. And that's where, again, when people talk about higher price for fertilizer, like, does that mean they use a lot? Yes. Now, I think outside of a few sort of like, boardroom decision type things where it's, this is how we do it, the farmer tends to be a bit more agile, and he or she does not want to use more fert than they need, more chemical than they need, because those things always cost money, right? That's a big part of the input side. So we're going to see, what they do and how they perform, but they will be trying to maximize production. And the job of the market, in any industry, is to, eliminate the high cost producer. What makes agriculture so interesting is because of the government tentacles all over the world in different aspects of agriculture, the high cost producer is often not knowledgeable of the fact that he or she is the high cost producer. So you do see a lot of people kind of, staying in business, and things are complicated, obviously, by foreign exchange and stuff like that. But you mentioned Brazil, and I think, Brazil is an interesting case because, Bolsonaro, he has, support in a lot of areas, but one concentrated area of support that he has is sort of in the rural communities and the farming communities. And Brazil's taken some steps, either, I'm not sure exactly how they did it, but, the farmers, they're the next big crop that needs inputs. They're planting their soybeans and some corn right now in Brazil. And the expectation is that that's going to be a massive crop. And from all reports, they have adequate supplies of fertilizer and chemicals, ready to go for that crop. And again, as I say, that group of people is, pretty content with Bolsonaro.
I guess so. I mean, they may have, which by the way is amazing. I feel like I was reading headlines 6 months ago that the Brazilians were not going to have fertilizer, and that's why Bolsonaro was in Moscow a week or two beforehand, and everybody was worried about Brazilian access to fertilizer. But what about, because I mean, the weather's been really bad in Brazil for 2 years now, and it looks like we're going to get another La Nina season here for a third year. I wonder what you think the cumulative effects are on dry, warmer weather in both the U.S. Southwest and in South America. Because, I mean, the Southern Cone, if you look at the NASA satellite photos, I mean, it's pretty stark, the level of drought they've been dealing with in the last 2 years. And I guess to your point, farmers are resilient. They're still able to yield even in really difficult conditions. But man, I mean, going on year 3 of this, I wonder what you think is going to happen because of this triple dip La Nina, especially in South America.
Yeah, I mean, if it does materialize or continue, would probably be the better word. I mean, there will be some scale back in production. I mean, recently I've read a few things. I mean, not being a meteorologist or a weather specialist myself, but I read a few things that say that, there are some indications that might be flipping from a La Nina to an El Nino, sort of around Christmas time. And that would be, fairly ideal. Again, I think the critical weather is ahead of us. And, in Brazil, I would say they need probably, good to slightly above average weather to pull off the big crop that they have. In parts of the U.S., like say Kansas and Texas, I think they need, well above average weather to kind of get back on track. And that's just sort of what's happened over the last couple months. But one thing I always caution people about is like, in the planting sequence, it's very hard to eliminate production then, because the only acre with no potential is the acre that does not get planted. And I think like what we've heard from Brazil over the last, say, week or 10 days is that, people are out there, they're planting. I mean, everybody intends to plant. We haven't heard too many farmers saying, I'm waiting until X amount of rain comes, then I'm going to plant. They're optimistic at this moment. And again, with the state of the foreign exchange, the real, and the price of soybeans, and what happened in the market when the USDA came out with a slightly smaller soybean yield and reduced the acres a little bit and popped the prices on the futures again, there's a lot of incentivization to plant. And what I always say about South America is they don't plant fence to fence. They plant, they've ripped out all the fences. They're planting every available square inch. And if they don't have that square inch, somebody clears a little bit more space for them and they plant a little bit more acres there.
Yeah, that's as good a segue as we're going to get into the role of the U.S. dollar in all this. I'll throw a little shade here at financial journalism because I feel like every day for the last couple of weeks it's been U.S. dollar hits 20-year high, and then whatever the headline was of the day. So my favorite was this morning: U.S. dollar hits 20-year high because Putin announces partial mobilization. I'm sure we'll keep going on with that for the next 20 days as well for whatever's in the headlines. But how does that stronger U.S. dollar? Well, I guess two questions. Do you feel like the dollar is anywhere close to peaking? I've sort of got my spidey sense up to maybe we're starting to get to the. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet. I wouldn't stake my reputation on that, but it feels like the dollar is getting pretty long in the tooth. But then also, how does that strong U.S. dollar affect farmers from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really make a claim to know when or where, it's going to stop. I think one thing I was thinking about earlier is I was thinking like, in recent history, when we had sort of like low inflation rates and low interest rates, when the government wanted to enact a policy, or even if they wanted to sort of, interfere in their exchange rate or something like that. I'm not saying that the U.S. does or anything like that, but, they had the means by which to do it. When you're trying to, cut down on inflation, it's hard to, even like in the realm of agriculture, if you want to do a program to sort of like, smooth out the bumps and make sure that farmers plant and have everything that they do, like by injecting money into the system directly, I mean, that's probably not going to help the, what's happening with inflation, I guess, so to speak. But what I would say is, generally, like a lot of the countries that we're talking about, the farmer, how does he have the impact of a stronger U.S. dollar? Like a stronger U.S. dollar, all things being equal, some Latin ceteris paribus would be that, a stronger U.S. dollar is negatively correlated with commodity prices, meaning commodity prices go down when the dollar rises. Now, there's lots of other factors in there, but whatever. And, from an individual country that's dealing in foreign exchange, that means that the cost of largely denominated imports denominated in U.S. dollars, those cost more in the local currency. So your incentivization to import is less. and you can make more local currency revenue by exporting. So your incentive to export is more. So you take a country like the European Union, which sort of had a rough patch with their corn crop and even, disappointing wheat crop. And you think, oh, all things being, they should be importing. But the farmer and the farm community has actually got the food community, they've got the incentive to sort of export because the euro's, in the toilet, and everything that they want to import, be it durum wheat or corn or barley or whatever. I mean, now it's costing more, again, ceteris paribus, you know what I mean? So that is a sticky thing. But I mean, again, we're never in an equilibrium in foreign exchange. I mean, it's always changing. So when you say it's an expensive or a cheap foreign exchange, I mean, it's only relative to sort of your last few moments or your last few years. And then I think things start to adjust. I mean, will the US dollar permanently be high? Probably not. It's going to go low at some point. But the one thing I don't think is going to happen, because I don't see anything on the horizon to replace it, is it's still going to be, something that people want to hold when they're nervous about, geopolitics, macroeconomics, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I mean, as far as I can see, geopolitics and macroeconomics both look pretty concerning right now. And, I just think I think, Bitcoin didn't replace the US dollar. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, the times in history that a reserve currency has been displaced by some up and comer, it's been cataclysmic events. I mean, it was World War I and it took both World War I and World War II to get the pound sterling to give way to the US dollar. The pound sterling only picks up because of the Napoleonic Wars and because, France completely falls apart in its quest for empire to go from the franc to the sterling. So I think people underestimate the level of dysfunction it takes to get that kind of switch. It's also, to your point, it's the same with reserve currency. It's not like 100% of people were ever just using the dollar. It sort of goes between 60% at a high, 40% at a low, and then all the other ones are kind of in there. And to your point, I mean, the Russians made big news when they said they were going to sell some of their natural gas to China in sort of half rubles and half yuan. I thought that was some nice Chinese charity to the Russians on that score. But it's not do you know a Canadian farmer that's about to accept yuan in his pocket for whatever he's going to sell to China? I don't know of a U.S. farmer who's going to accept those sorts of things. So I think a lot of that is overblown. And to your point, I often actually say this to American audiences, because when I go and speak in front of American audiences, I talk about all the problems that the United States is having. And then I always end that section with a picture of the US dollar and with the point that, you might feel screwed over here, but I guarantee you literally every other country in the world would love to be in the situation that we are in the United States, even with all the things that we just kind of talked about. So I kind of take your point there. Neil, it's kind of amazing. I'm proud of us for getting more than 30 minutes through a podcast that is about agriculture and geopolitics and not mentioning China, because I think too much attention sometimes gets paid to China, but we also can't ignore them. We also especially can't ignore them because, we were talking about drought in Brazil. They've got a pretty epic drought over there in China as well. I mean, the Chinese government coming out and saying something like 50 to 75% of yields getting slashed in terms of projections and things like that. So where are you at with thinking about China right now? On the one hand, they've nominally supported Russia. We had this Taiwan Strait crisis. It seems like the U.S.-China trade war is starting to pick up again with all these sort of not new tariffs, but new, very, very surgical, I think, moves from the United States government to crack down on technology exports to China. But at the same time, I mean, it looks like China's going to need to import sort of food commodities and at a larger rate because of the drought that's happening there. So how are you feeling about the Chinese market these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way I said it earlier today to somebody was that, they're the 1.4 billion people in the room that, question, right? I mean, they're everything really. And because I guess the way I always say it is the incremental ton is in China somewhere, right? It's either they need it or they have it, right? And if they have it, then your prospects going forward mean that, whatever that market is, are going to be somewhat less because, it's already there. They don't need to buy it, right? Mm-hmm. I think on all levels, and I'm not an expert on, broader macroeconomics, but I think on all levels, like, if we're looking at the current situation of the global economy, we want China to kick into gear. We want them to be that engine that sort of has a growth, and they're buying things and they're selling things and they're making things. And it's all done with, an interest in commerce and an interest in, global trade. And we want them to be our partner. On the food side, I think it is an enigma. We don't know, like, we can't know for sure if there's stocks or there's stocks. And even when you tell me that the yields are down 50 to 75%, I mean, what's the next messaging that's coming out?
Yeah.
And I think, like, I talk about this a lot when I develop strategies for customers to, decide upon, when we sell and how we sell. And I say that, even when you're inert, it should be a strategic inertia, meaning like you're doing nothing because you're planning or you're waiting for something to happen. And I think in the past, China's been good at strategic inertia. They've waited, and sometimes they've sort of outweighted the market, and they've managed to get prices to go now. And to my way of thinking, their behavior in the last few years has shown that maybe their inertia isn't strategic. Maybe their inertia is because they're still trying to get themselves outside of a situation, be it COVID related, be it like overproducing, apartment buildings and this kind of stuff. And now they're like, wait a minute, what's next? Now, maybe that all coalesces. I'll ask you this question. Do you think that Chinese policy, Chinese performance, do you think that it gets more clarity after they have their next big Congress and supposedly nominate Xi for another at least 6 years of being president?
I'll go a little bit on a limb here and say that I think the party Congress issue is totally artificial. And I think that in the Western media, people are paying attention to it just because it's a nice, easy signpost that they can use to say to really throw up their hands and, to your point, say we don't know what's going on in China, so let's point at this party Congress and say, well, until the party Congress, we can't actually say anything. It kind of smacks as bullshit to me, and I say that because I know when I get cornered on a question in China, I'll throw out the party Congress line because I don't have the answer, so I'll just say it. It seems to me it's very clear what's going on in China. Xi Jinping is in charge. He's going to be in charge as long as he wants to be in charge and as long as he doesn't get hit by a bus. He is rooting out any opposition in the system to him. He's appointing loyalists, throughout all the different cadres. And even with this real estate bubble that we've talked about frequently on this podcast and that Rob and I sort of focus on every week, I mean, part of that is because she wanted to crack down on the property developers. One of the most interesting articles I read this week was about how some of the state-backed property developers who listened to Xi initially are actually doing great because they're getting preferential loans and low interest rates on all the things like that. So in some ways, the story might not be, oh my God, real estate crisis in China. It might be, the Chinese just wiped out these quote unquote private real estate developers because they weren't listening to Xi, and those that did listen to Xi, they're the ones that are going to go along. And there is this interesting trend. It's not just in China of how governments are starting to intervene in some of these problem sectors. It's not just a China thing. We talked about Russia and Gazprom earlier. Germany is nationalizing one of their big energy companies today, Uniper. I mean, it's, when you kind of look around, you're starting to see government intervention in all these different areas. But so to go back to the question that you asked, though, if something happened in the party Congress where she anointed a successor and was going to promise to turn over power in 5 years to him, then I'm wrong, and then I'll stop and I'll sort of reconsider. But I'm pretty sure the party Congress is just a rubber stamp. The more interesting thing to me is how is he doing sort of getting in front of this real estate crisis, and it's really mixed. I mean, some indicators are going well, some indicators are not going well. The Taiwan issue, it's remarkable how much China's come off of the Taiwan issue. I was expecting a much longer, prolonged Taiwan Strait crisis. It really wasn't that prolonged a crisis. They sort of threw a fit for 2 weeks, and that was kind of it. So I don't know. My impression is that the Chinese economy is under some stress, and that she would like to not rock the boat all that much. And the last thing I'll just say is, she has lent some sort of tacit support to Russia in the context of this war in Ukraine. But I think that's starting to flag a little bit too. If you read the Chinese readout from Xi and Putin's meeting in Kazakhstan last week, like it was not nearly as flowery as, say, Xi's readout from the Kazakhstan meeting or some of these other countries in Central Asia, where China is basically just moving in as the Russian influence is moving out. I think one of the underreported stories, I mean, I think it was Reuters had it, but the Chinese are importing more LNG from the Russians, but then they're turning around and exporting the LNG that they get from Australia and other places and selling it on the spot market for a tidy profit back to the Europeans. So it's not like they're just supporting the Russians at all. They're making money off of the Russian decision to kind of go in Ukraine. So I think it's more about, what's going on in the Chinese economy. And I go back and forth. I go back and forth between whether this real estate crisis is really going to kick into gear or whether they're going to be able to sweep it all under the rug like they did with their non-performing loan crisis in the late 90s.
I guess that's a good question because, again, turning to our webinar, just a question that more ordinary people have than geopolitical, macroeconomic, or the kind of experts you have, on your excellent podcast. But, if I'm speaking to a farmer and he's looking at the situation and he's saying, like, what is going to turn this market around? Now, earlier you kind of said that you thought maybe we were getting close to the apex of, say, the rise of the US dollar, which could be one indication that, a bit of stability is coming back into the market. But, what are the catalysts that are going to kind of pull us out of where we are right now?
That's a good question. I can't tell you that I have great answers, but I mean, and I don't know how you approach farmers when I talk about this, but when I talk to farmers about this, I urge them not to think so much about China. I urge them to make money off of China as long as there is an opportunity to make money off of China. But when you look at sort of wheat imports or corn imports or soybean exports all across the world, especially in the US, Canada, there's a disproportionate focus on the Chinese market. And that's because it's easy. There's 1.4 or however 1.2, there's however many billion of them sitting there. And it's an easy market to sell to. And that's what we're kind of used to for the past 30 years. But look around at the rest of the world. There's plenty of opportunities. Let's talk about Indonesia, or let's talk about parts of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. They're importing hand over fist. Pakistan and India, they're not reliable because one year they'll have a great crop and then one year they'll have a crappy crop. So you can't just sort of pencil it in that I'm going to export this much to this country at this time every single year. But yeah, I'm dancing around your question. What are some of the things that could add some more stability, kind of to geopolitics in the market? As long as the Russia-Ukraine war is going on, as long as we're talking about, is Europe going to be in an energy crisis, or China and the United States going to be at odds because they're on opposite sides of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I don't know that you can have a stable global environment where a war of that magnitude is taking place. So until we get some kind of resolution there, like we can kind of get to I don't want to say normal. We can desensitize ourselves to what's happening in Europe right now, but we're still dealing with the largest war in Europe since World War II, with millions of people displaced, with tens of thousands of people dead, and with great powers on both sides supporting opposing sides. Like, I don't see any macro stability in this world until you get some kind of resolution on that conflict, and we're nowhere close. So, the day that Putin stops threatening nuclear weapons and talking about mass mobilization and actually wants to negotiate with the Ukrainians, maybe we can talk about some of these, instability factors, at least from a geopolitical stance coming off. How much that's tied to inflation and whether we might get some resolution there, also really hard to say. I mean, energy prices were super low going into COVID. They've kind of roared back. I do think that by the middle of the decade, end of the decade, energy is probably going to be deflationary again. But that's also until we get more renewable capacity coming online and we figure out a little bit how to get ourselves out of this pickle from underinvestment in the hydrocarbons. That's another thing sort of driving uncertainty there too. So I don't feel good about things resolving here in the next year or two. Do you see anything on the horizon that makes you think we'll get some clarity?
I guess one thing we haven't talked about, we don't, a great unknown in the agricultural sphere is just, weather. And I mean, it's hard to pinpoint, a weather versus climate, but I think, like, with the incentivization the way it's been over the last couple of years, where we've seen these relatively high prices, and then the farmer reaction to even when the prices start to decline is to yield your way to freedom. I'd say, like, one thing that could offer, it's not the kind of stability farmers probably want, but one thing that could offer a bit more stability would be, just general success for farmers around the world. And that starts with the Brazilian Argentine crop, which we've talked about a bit. But I mean, if they do pull off sort of, I think the number's around about 200 million tons collectively for soybeans. If we're sitting here in May and that's sort of what they look like they got, that probably will be something that stabilizes grains and oilseeds markets, meaning, like, we're going to, and again, it'll be lower, but it will just be like, we have a big supply there that gives some assurance that if somebody wants to import some, they're going to be able to import some. Now, the corollary to that is the demand side. And, the demand side is still probably in a recovery phase from what happened with COVID and what happened with, prices spiking and all of that uncertainty. And, there was some demand destruction, how much demand destruction, what's going to happen and all that kind of thing. I think the demand side is inexplicable, very tied in with the broader macroeconomic and even to an extent geopolitical situation, because we always say people need to eat, but we never say what they need to eat and how much they need to eat, right? And again, I think that one thing we've seen in the last little while is, which never materialized from the war starting, was an urgency of people saying, like, I better lock down supply. And I think it was a negative inertia. I think people didn't lock down a supply because they were just like, I don't know what to do. But in the end, it was probably the right tactic, because there's going to end up being enough supply. And I mean, despite what the UN sort of says, and I don't know if they've done a good job or a bad job. That's one question I have for you, is like, how has the UN performed in this, like, in the war situation? I mean, today they were out kind of saying, like, we need cheaper fertilizer prices, but I don't see the level of urgency where somebody who might have been food insecure prior to the war in Russia, in Ukraine and Russia, are they actually, are there more people who are food insecure? Maybe, but they never solved the problem of the first guy. So how are they going to solve the problem of the second guy? And how do you think the UN and these different organizations, FAO, have performed in this area?
I mean, I don't want to shit on the UN, so I won't spend too much time.
Please, come on.
No, I don't want to spend too much dwelling. I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on the fact that no one listens to them or pays any attention or cares. They become a vehicle for, like, other countries' political interests. So, I mean, if Russia decides they want to cut off fertilizer exports, like, they'll start getting the UN to dance, maybe not necessarily to the tune that they called, but certainly to at least a version of it, or to a cover of it. But I think the thing that these international organizations have struggled with the most are, these international organizations are designed for a world that is supposed to be moving more and more towards free trade and more towards globalization, and where the United States is the top dog and is sort of securing everything, and everybody sort of has the same interest. And that's not what's happening anymore. And I think that's another thing that it's difficult for farmers to deal with. And it's difficult when I talk to farmers to express this, because for so long, the way that farmers make their money is to export abroad. And that's just not how things are going right now, because certain countries are raising up protectionist controls whenever it sort of suits them. So if we just think about the last month, I mean, India decided to slap, export restrictions on rice. Then you see, in response to that, Vietnamese and Thai farmers are saying, well, we want a minimum price for our rice that we're going to export, so that's going to go up. On the GrainFox platform, I talked about, and Rob and I talked about this on the podcast I can't remember if that's weeks or months. My sense of space and time is completely obliterated since having a kid. But the price of cacao, and how even in the Ivory Coast and places like Ghana, the farmers are saying, well, we don't want to sell this stuff unless the government is going to guarantee us sort of a minimum price, because we can't actually make money if we're going to continue to sell to the lowest common denominator and the lowest price. So if you have a world where that's happening, the sort of medicine that the FAO and the UN is going to prescribe is not really going to work, because they're prescribing medicine in a world where you don't have protectionism and where people are trying to get rid of protectionism, not the opposite. And so I think we have to think, or at least I think farmers need to think in terms of make some more money off of your what's the right word? Think a little more regional, think a little more local. Not everything can be export abroad to sort of make up for it. If you're having to pay higher price for inputs and things like that, you need to get more from what you're selling. And maybe that means sell to the local fancy restaurant that people are going to go into credit card debt to take themselves out and their spouse to on a dinner date. I mean, like, I don't know if that's actually viable on a macro scale, but it seems to me if we're moving away from globalization as sort of the modus vivendi of the global economy, and if organizations like the FAO and the UN, people are listening to them even less than they did before, which was not a whole lot, that export sort of system starts to break a little bit, especially if you're the farmer. But maybe I'm overstretching there.
Well, I think you're raising actually an incredible point there, and congratulations on becoming a father as well. That's monumental. But
I'm just trying to follow in your footsteps over here.
There's a lot of there's a lot of concern about the wrong things, obviously everywhere on earth. Like, people get agitated by things that really they shouldn't be agitated by, and I think about the dear Canadian farmers, and a certain percentage of them, a large percentage of them, they were very, very upset. Trudeau is persona non grata. They are not a fan of his at all. And they were very upset about sort of, this perception that the Dutch farmers were going to be removed access to fertilizers, and that was going to come to Canada. What I would be much more concerned with if I were a farmer, and where I'd want my checkoff money to go, is as much as Canada or any one country can sort of like promote globalism. And I know everybody hates the World Economic Forum or whatever, but the silos and the farms and the trucks and the railroad systems and the highways that we have in Western Canada and a lot of those in North Dakota and places like that as well are built on the back of international trade and market access. And to think that we're going down a pathway where market access could be more limited because of these different things, I mean, that is going to have the largest, most negative impact on the profitability and the land prices and everything that you do as a farmer in sort of the Western Canadian jurisdiction and our friends in the Northern Plains. Now, there's certain anecdotes to exporting, renewable diesel, biofuel, ethanol, those kinds of things. And I mean, they're all very popular now, but what happens to ethanol and renewable diesel and biofuels when, 75% of the car fleet is electric, plug-in electric? You know what I mean? Like, is that a long-term salve for what worries us? I don't know. It could be, but I'm just saying, like, when I got into this industry, I came from I was a lawyer first, and I came into this because it was, we were going to move the rules of trade for agriculture into the GATT, and which eventually became the WTO. And, still 20 years later, 25 years later, I mean, agriculture is still by far the most complicated, government interfered into sector. And you mentioned, some guy producing a specialty crop for, a nearby restaurant. But if we, go back to Ricardian economics and we say people should be doing, what's the most productive thing in a global sense and trading that thing, the sort of bespoking of agriculture is actually like, that's a great inefficiency. And we are, I would say there's no bigger inefficient, not saying farmers are inefficient. I'm just saying like the trade of agricultural goods is still inefficient. And I don't think anybody's starving on earth because there isn't enough food on earth. I think it's because we're just inefficient at getting them the food that they need, right? And we probably don't care too, myself excepted. I care so much.
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't know you used to be a lawyer. So here's a really terrible dad joke for you. So there's a lawyer playing golf. and he gets hit by a ball, and the player comes over looking for the ball, and the lawyer says, look, I'm a lawyer and you hit me with this ball, this is going to cost you $5,000. And the golfer says, I'm sorry, but I did say 4 before I hit the ball. And the lawyer says, I'll take it. But really great joke there from me. I hope you're
Yeah,
all
no, I've heard
laughing.
them all. I mean, hopefully I'll write some myself someday. But no, I was a lawyer who realized that I thought like an economist. Now I'm not saying that's an upgrade or a downgrade, but it's something.
Yeah, I took one class in the law school at Cornell University and decided that was not for me. What were we talking about before I told my horrible dad joke about lawyers? Oh yeah, about the specialty crops and about sort of the focus on the change away. I mean, I like Ricardo, but I mean, economics doesn't care about people starving, right? Or I should say, the market doesn't necessarily care about people starving. That's not what the market is designed to take care of. Like you said, what was the market designed to do? Get rid of the high cost producer. It's not designed to make sure that the people of Somalia can get access to food that they can't pay for in the middle of a famine, right? And if we're gonna make access to food, and you're right, you're absolutely right. We produce way more than enough food for everyone. There's no reason. Well, I shouldn't say there's no reason. Like, there's plenty of food on Earth. Like, there's enough food so that the world doesn't have to, that nobody has to go hungry if we figured out how to efficiently get things from point A to point B. But that's not what this market is supposed to do. This market, as you said, it's supposed to get rid of the high cost producer. It's supposed to drive down the cost of all these things. If we had been as successful at driving down the cost of energy as we have with food, our energy bills would be pennies on the dollar right now. That's like the relative scale versus how we've been able to drive down food prices. So I don't know how you fix that in a way that is equitable. The one thing I'll say for organizations like the UN and the FAO is that they were in some ways instruments of US power, but they were also expressions of a deep optimism about what the future of the world might be and about how we could cooperate as a world in some of these different areas. And unfortunately, I'm in the business of saying that doesn't work.
Yeah, but I think from a standpoint of sort of like an international organization or corporation, and your McDonald's, your Starbucks, your whatever. I mean, you got a couple different tactics that you can use, and one of them is like you can try to upsell people who are already used to buying your stuff. Or the other one is, and I would think that the corporate leaders of the world, we want world income to go up. And I think the only instrument that's showing that can happen in a sustained manner is sort of like globalization and free trade. Because, once you go to a place, and, I've been to a lot of countries and come back, had the fortunate thing to come back, several years later. Now, some people would decry this as like, oh, a crime against humanity, whatever. But, like the shopping mall or the food court or whatever. And, like there are a lot of, even if it's not exactly KFC, there's a product sort of like KFC, and in fact, a lot of times it is KFC or it is McDonald's or it is Starbucks. And I'm just saying that, like, I think like we focus a lot on sort of like, a guy with a bowl, and it's like, sort of like a Dickensian thing. And they're like, oh, I don't have any food. I want some porridge. And I think like, what I've observed in my travels around the world is, and for better or worse, I mean, I'm a heavier guy and I've seen more heavier people because they're eating these processed Western foods or whatever. But I think like, people want diversity of choice in what they eat. Now, a lot of times that matriculates into fast food or whatever. But I'm just saying that, like, ultimately everybody, like because we are sort of slaves to capitalism, and I think that's okay with me. I mean, we can argue about it and, the semantics of it or whatever, and winners and losers and all that. But, to be an ordinary person in Canada, the US, or Europe, and increasingly so in a place like India and even China, a lot of your material needs are met. Now you've become sort of like a customer, now you're choosing a brand name or something like that. Mm-hmm. And ultimately pushing more people in places like India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Africa into the place where, they've got their immediate needs met because, now you've built a grocery store, they have some income, they have this, they have that. I think it should stabilize the world, and it should be somewhat beneficial, bearing in mind that, the instability that might be created by everybody trying to live the same lifestyle on the climate, or, climate change. That would be sort of the existential question, shall we say. But I'm a big proponent of free trade. I think the agricultural sector should see a lot less interference. I think farmers should be, and again, this is not going to be a popular opinion amongst my own clients, but I think there should be a lot less subsidies for farmers. I think, we can talk about insurance schemes for the environmental problems, but I just think, like, we want to encourage the producers to produce through market signals, not through governmental signals. And the way we get those market signals is as refined as possible, is to have the freest possible trade, so we really know where people and want it and what they want. And this is why, the alleged sort of stocks that China has are so distorting, because if they do have 250 million tons of this or that in storage there, why? Like, does that enhance any of their food security? Like, I'm not sure it does. Again, people will question that, but because they don't want to eat it as wheat, they don't want to eat it as, raw corn. They want to eat it as, like, things that might be better placed in Australia, like giant herds of cattle eating forage, like, and able to be shipped there on airplanes, or, and I've seen that happen, like, 500 cows on an airplane flying to China. I mean, we've got the means to kind of transport this stuff around there and just trade in a more efficient manner.
Just pause for a second. I think we live in a time where it's possible to put 500 cows in an airplane and send them to China. It's what times we live in. I mean, I agree with you. I just don't think it's going to go that way. And you've already mentioned China. As long as India and China and Russia and a couple other players are going to have protectionist policies when it comes to agriculture, if the other ones are playing by the rules, it's not really going to work for you unless you somehow excise those other ones out. So at that point, you probably do need the government to come and support. I don't know that the way that the government is doing it is particularly effective, but it was, I shouldn't say it was relatively uncontroversial, but one of the only things I think one of the only truly bipartisan bills that passed in the United States in the past couple of years was this CHIPS Act, that they wanted, U.S. government support for a semiconductor champion. It's not that different from agriculture if you're facing other countries that, like you said, are stocking up or are putting on these export restrictions or throwing up these tariffs and these protectionist barriers, because all of those things, if you get even just a couple dominoes in the chain not playing ball, it's going to be hard for the rest of the market to kind of work at it in a fair way.
And, you make a good point, because maybe I'm an optimist, but I'm certainly becoming more pessimistic, because I think one thing I thought, say, 10 years ago, say in the Arab Spring, the early days of that, is I thought that, the social media and the phone and everything like this, and even just, the overpowering nature of, like, cultural things like movies and television and brand names and rappers and these kinds of things, how they're sort of universally liked by young people around the world. And I kind of thought that, young people around the world they were moving towards a oneness, shall we say, where, they all were sort of interested in the same stuff, kind of being their own person in that. And I guess in the last 10 years, I mean, compared to, sort of electoral politics in the US and Canada and even in Europe, I mean, you'd say that probably even there's many more divisions now coming in. We haven't seen that oneness develop. We've seen more of a stringency, and maybe that's going to happen around the world and prevent us from getting to that area where, and that again, somebody who wanted to argue with me would say, well, that's capitalism. It's going to be competition, and it's going to be survival of the fittest. And, people are not going to sing Kumbaya and collaborate. They're going to try to outmuscle and and if the playing field is tilted in one direction, like, Facebook has an advantage, then they're going to try and tilt it back so that Facebook doesn't have an advantage, and it's, TikTok or something else. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's interesting, because I just think, like, I look at sort of a longer term solution to even out the spikes and the peaks and the valleys of being a farmer. And I think like that answer is somewhere in a freer trade with less government interference in the marketplace. And you have convinced me that that will not happen. So we can dream.
I mean,
or we can be real.
It could happen one day. I mean, the problem with that scenario is that, COVID should have been the thing that did that. We all should have gotten together on the same page when it came to COVID. And there was a part of me that thought, wow, this is like, the world is like, this disease is terrible, but this might be the thing that actually gets people to look past their geopolitical blinders and actually work with each other, because the virus didn't care whether we were American or Chinese or Russian or Ukrainian or this, that, or the other thing. It killed us all the same. And instead, COVID became a vehicle for geopolitical competition. So if we can't all get on the same page about sort of that kind of issue, getting on the same page about as contentious an issue as trade seems hard. The flip side, though, is that climate change is many magnitudes greater as a challenge overall than is COVID-19. So is there a scenario in which climate change becomes so cataclysmic that countries are forced to work together because we're thinking about survival and not necessarily about sort of these fears that drive geopolitical competition? Maybe aliens will actually invade, we'll get Independence Day, the movie, in real life, and all these different countries and farmers will come together and revolt against our alien overlords. But I think it's going to take that kind of external threat, or we're going to go through one of these, competitive cycles where one country emerges dominant at the end and gets to write the rules that everybody is willing to follow. Those are the scenarios in where you get that kind of everybody pulling in the same direction. And unfortunately, there's nothing in the world right now that suggests to me we're going that route, as much as I dislike to say it. So.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. I mean, I think cooperative models are probably the best models in terms of, advancing the most amount of people. But again, I agree with your take on COVID and on the climate change, which I think should be something like, farmers are sort of, not all farmers, but a subset of farmers are sort of, they're in denial because they feel that the policy around agriculture is going to be negatively impacted by climate change. But I would say that hasn't been decided yet. It could be a really net gain for many farmers because, they control the land. And I mean, if there's something that they can do, like monetizing carbon and stuff like that, I mean, potentially they could end up being somewhat winners on that by adopting certain practices. And many of those practices are already in place. But again, the mindset isn't there to see it as a broad enough mindset isn't there to see it as a potential, good or something like that. But I mean, we've sort of strayed off maybe where we were going, which is part of the beauty of your podcast. But I would want to say, like, just in the immediate future, like what are the key challenges you see just even in the next 3 months for sort of where we're going right now? Like, I think that's something the farmers ask me all the time too. And I was saying, like, I want to ask somebody who really has their pulse on what's happening.
Yeah. I'm also not a weatherman, so I can't say anything about that. And by the way, aliens, if you're listening out there, maybe send us like your second-rate invasion force, like one that's not so strong that you would conquer us, but one strong enough to put us all on the same page. If you can hear this, we would appreciate it. I mean, the boring answer to me is it comes down to European energy prices and what's going to happen in the European winter. So I spent most of today, for example, doing research trying to figure out what 2 degrees lower centigrade would mean in terms of natural gas consumption, European Union countries, and which countries are going to be best sort of suited to deal with that. I think it really, for me, the biggest issue over the next 3 months is how far can Ukraine push and how resilient can the European Union be in the face of what Russia's doing. If you get a big reversal in this conflict, if Russia's able to sort of make its gains and sort of establish them, and Europe has to capitulate to Russia, that's going to be a big signal to other countries that, might actually does make right, and things are actually, you have to go get what you want to get. And Russia has just showed us the blueprint for how to defend your national interests in a system that was rigged against you, versus if the vaunted Russian military gets its butt kicked by the Ukrainians, and the Europeans are able to get through the winter without the end of European civilization as a result of high energy prices, then I think people start looking at the energy transition and all the policies the Europeans are going to have put in place in order to survive the winter. And we might all be looking at Europe as a blueprint for how to deal with our own energy crises in our own different countries like that, because they just had to sort of deal with it at first. So I think that's the center of gravity. For me, if you could tell me, if I could sort of have one statistic from the future told to me right now, I would love to know what the price of natural gas in Europe was on January 21st, 2023. Like if I could have one piece of information about the next couple of months, like that's the piece of information that I would choose to have, because I think that'll tell you kind of what's going on in the world and where we're going from both a macro perspective and a geopolitical perspective. What's the answer for you?
Well, I mean, I think the war is a big one. I mean, I think, if the war were to end in such a way that there was a pathway for Russia to be back in the community of nations fully. Again, I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm saying if that were to happen, I think then, many of the commodities that I deal with would kind of ratchet down in price, and that would really take, the tempest out of the teapot, so to speak. And again, I did like your answer because, you started it by saying a message to the aliens. And again, I don't want to, I'm just going to say, like there's a joke about anal probing somewhere in there, but I won't make it. But just say like, I'm not a good candidate. Anyways, and that's just like, I fear aliens, because that seems to be one of their pastimes. But anyways, the other thing I would say is that, the price of natural gas on January 21st, 2023 is another thing that, has a whole bunch of, real world politic aspects to it, but it also has that thing that we're always sort of out of control of. We don't control is what is the weather in the first 3 weeks of January and the last 2 weeks of December, right? And if we're just unlucky enough to have like a crazy cold period, that's going to impact that versus if we have an average or we have an above average temperature cycle. And it's interesting how, and you were kind of saying it in an earlier answer too, that, maybe that will be the catalyst for global cooperation. And, when you talk about movies like Independence Day or, the others in those genres by the same director, like, there was one where there was a giant ice cap or, that came down. I can't remember the name of that one, The Day After Tomorrow or something like that.
Well, we definitely have to shout out Mars Attacks, which is the greatest of this genre.
Mars Attacks was fantastic. A lot of times those kind of unfolded with, nobody saw what was happening. What scares me about sort of like global climate change is that, like we see what's happening and we still don't have sort of the cooperative ability. And I mean, again, like, it's hard to look at like Pakistan and say, okay, they had the floods because of, climate change, like likely for sure. But, if you just look at, and I don't want to debate this or anything, but you look at like, the number of illegal immigrants showing up at the U.S. border, despite the fact that, I don't think the U.S. is shrouded in glory, say over the last 3 or 4 years, as looking like the world's most inviting place and all of that. And I've seen a lot of work done on like, one of the reasons migrants are moving that direction. This is the early stages of, where they're living is the economy is being hampered by climate conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Neil, on that note, I think we should probably put a pin in it. But I hope you'll come. Maybe we'll have you back on January 21st, 2023. Was
that about anal probing again when you said put a pin in it? Because I'm not, I had that happen to me once, and it wasn't a good experience out in the wilds of Manitoba. So,
look, the sequel to Mars Attacks is, of course, going to be Uranus Attacks. So we'll all tune in for that.
I'll always be more of a Saturn man myself.
So, there you go. Well, Neil, it's always good to talk to you, man. And if you're lucky enough to see us in action in a month's time, you can check us out again, October 13th. GrainFox. We'll put some details in the description, but I'm sure Neil will be back in the meantime. So. Neil, talk to you soon, man. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.